Tape's rolling. 1, 2, 1.
Tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere.
Continuing, rather wrapping up this morning, our No Room series, a series that we have been spending time with over the course of this Advent season, a series that has been looking at stories and interactions, opportunities, moments in which Jesus has reached out, in which Jesus has come into contact with people, with groups of people, with individuals of people, the ways in which Jesus has came and crossed lines, oftentimes social lines, social boundaries, in order to make room in God's kingdom for those who were told they otherwise did not belong. That was kind of a long explanation. No Room is about the ways that Jesus makes room for us, for you, in his kingdom. Despite the sin, despite the brokenness, despite all the things that so often get in the way, get and stand between us and salvation, between us and the Father, between us and God, Jesus came and made room. And that is, in so many ways, that is perhaps the most profound, the most beautiful, the most wonderful piece of this entire series and everything that we have been looking at, and the stories that we have been looking at. That is perhaps one of the most profound, beautiful, wonderful truths of the incarnation itself, of the birth of Jesus itself, that God came to us so that we would have a place with him. Jesus dealt during his time here on earth, frequently dealt with tension between himself and his disciples and the religious elite, the groups known as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Over and over and over again, and we have seen this in the stories that we have been looking at for the last few weeks, over and over and over again, we see Jesus being confronted by the very group and by the groups and by the people who very much firmly believed that they were in, that they had it right, that they were the right ones, they were the worthy ones, versus those who so often were told that they had to keep going further and further out, those who were so frequently pushed further and further out to the fringes and told that they did not belong, that they were not worthy, that they were outcasts, they were ragamuffins. When we get into the book of Acts, in the book of Acts, we start to look at the stories of the early church, and we see that even in the early church, as romanticized and as good and sort of idealized as we so often want to look at and see and read these stories in the book of Acts, the early church itself dealt with the exact same tension points. But in the case of the early church, that tension developed between Jewish believers and Gentile believers. That Gentile-Jewish tension and conflict. In the story of Acts, in the book of Acts, we read and we see the story of how the gospel spread from its beginnings and its early roots in Jerusalem out further and further into bigger and bigger circles around the Roman Empire, finding its ways and pushing out further and further into the world, just as Jesus had told his disciples to do. But in order to spread, in order for the gospel to spread, in order for the church to grow, the early church had to deal with a group of people that they oftentimes referred to as Gentiles. They had to deal with and they had to ask and they had to answer a question that really seems quite stupid in many ways to us today. It's the question of, were Gentiles even allowed to be saved? And we kind of roll our eyes, we kind of shake our heads, and we wonder why would they even wonder that? But at that time, that was such a radical notion that somebody who was not ethnically Jewish could be considered an equal because of Jesus. In the book of Acts, we see a debate a fight in many ways, an argument break out between Peter and Paul. Peter, who was one of Jesus' own disciples, Peter, even though he had this vision of this sheet and all these unclean animals, and even heard a voice from God himself saying, take this food and eat it, because this stuff is now clean. What was once unclean, I am making it clean and okay for you to interact with. Peter remained focused on Jewish believers, but Paul, who was himself ethnically Jewish, Paul came to believe firmly that he was being sent to the Gentiles. And in going out to the Gentiles, one of the places that Paul found himself coming to was the city of Ephesus. And when he started the church in Ephesus, and when he wrote his letter to the church in Ephesus, he wrote a letter that was written to an incredibly diverse group. The church of Ephesus was really messed up. There were a lot of problems, a lot of conflicts that were going on there, but it was a group who struggled enormously with the tension between Jewish believers and Gentile believers. The book of Ephesus is also in many ways a great ending for this series, for this No Room series that we've been looking at. Because of that tension, it's a great reminder of the room that Jesus' birth and earthly ministry has made for you. For each and every one of us. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2, I'm going to pick up and start reading at verse 11. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 11. Paul, in writing this letter to the Ephesian Christians, has just finished up saying and writing what might very well be the most famous or well-known portion of the book of Ephesus, where he talks about how we are saved. Ephesians, the book of Ephesus. One of these days I'm going to get that right. The book of Ephesians, Paul has just finished talking about the most important, or maybe not the most important, all of it's important, but the most well-known, where he's emphasizing the fact that we are saved by grace through faith in Ephesians chapter 2, verses kind of 8 to 10, some of the first verses that many of us ever memorize in our life. But starting with verse 11, Ephesians 2, verse 11, here's what he says. He says, Therefore, because of you are saved by grace through faith, because of all this stuff you just got done saying, therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands, remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. So Paul, here in Ephesians 2, at the beginning of this text, Paul is addressing the segregation, which is a word that we've been using. Paul is going right after, and he's addressing the segregation that is taking place in the early church, in the Ephesian early church. And this segregation, this separation, this division that's taking place is taking place between a group of people who are being labeled as uncircumcised by or at the hands of another group that is referring to themselves as the circumcision. I get a kick out of the fact that they add the in there. The circumcision. It's not just uncircumcised and circumcised, it's uncircumcised and the circumcised. There's tension here, there's debate, there's conflict going on, and the sense that you get when you read Paul's words, and we start here, is that this group referring to themselves and calling themselves the circumcision are looking at the uncircumcised, the Gentiles, and they're thinking to themselves, you guys, we're not sure what to do with you. We're not sure that you are okay. And the tension is great. The tension is great. Paul is looking at this. He's looking at a group of people, a group of believers no less, that unfortunately have gotten themselves locked into a habit and a pattern of throwing labels and terms and accusations around. It's a bit like, dare I say it, it's a bit like being in a church today full of people who keep trying to label each other as libtards and trumplicans. There's a lot of tension that gets built up when you start throwing those terms around. That is essentially what is going on here with the Ephesian church. The Jewish believers are looking at the Gentiles saying, you uncircumcised. If you were as good as us, the circumcised, then it would be better. And you can almost imagine, or I can almost imagine, these Jewish believers, these circumcised believers, they're looking at the uncircumcised, they're looking at the Gentiles, and they're looking at them and they're saying, they in quotes, you might, maybe you might be believers. You might get into heaven. Maybe you might actually end up making it to the Messianic feast, the Messianic banquet table as they sort of conceived of as heaven. But when you get there, you're going to be sitting over in that other room. You might even be in a whole other building with a live feed being pumped in so you can see what's going on in the great hall. But we Jewish believers, we circumcised, we're the ones who get to sit at the table. We're going to be at the table with Jesus, not you. You're not going to get there. And Paul is sitting here and he points out in verse 11, he says, look, they're making these accusations. But these accusations and these labels and this tension that is developing, this conflict that is developing, this division that's developing, this stuff, he says in verse 11, he says, this is stuff that is done in the body by human hands. These are human distinctions that are going on here. And they're human distinctions, but they did bring very real spiritual consequences. I mean, it's hard to sit here and read through the Old Testament, especially where circumcision starts to come up. It's hard to read through the Old Testament and say, well, circumcision is just not important because it's pretty clear. Look, God commanded his people to get circumcised. It's a real thing. And so we kind of understand logically how we go from here in the Old Testament to where we are in Ephesians. It's kind of easy to understand how we got there. But the thing is that when you look at the Old Testament, you look at these stories of circumcision, God never says that the only people who are allowed to be circumcised are ethnic Jews. And that's where things at some point over the years started to go awry, started to go wonky. These Jewish believers began to think and believe that the only people who could legitimately be circumcised, the only people who could legitimately be included and welcomed into God's family are other ethnic Jewish believers. Gentiles, they're in the outer court. They kind of get to breathe the air and the smoke that comes from all the sacrifices and all the incense and everything else, but they don't get to see it. They don't get to touch it. They don't get to actually be involved. You have to keep them at a distance. And Paul here, when he shifts here, at this section in Ephesians 2, Paul is turning his attention and addressing specifically the Gentile believers, the people that have so long been told, you are not worthy. Paul is now speaking directly to them. He's saying, look, these distinctions, they're human distinctions. And yet, there is a sense, and there is a strong sense, that circumcision and uncircumcision is a visible, tangible, physical reality that declares and proclaims and shows and reveals that you are not welcome here because you are not the right kind of person. Paul says, let's talk about that a second. Let's see what happens here. Let's see what Jesus did here. And he gets to verse 13. So he says, so for those of you who are Gentiles, for those of you who are uncircumcised, for those of you who are constantly being pushed out to the outer edges, the outer fringes, for you, verse 13. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away, have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For those of you who are Gentiles, for those of you who have always been pushed to the outer fringes, have always been told that you are not welcome here, here's the thing. By the blood of Christ, by the blood of Jesus, you who were once far away have now been brought near to the kingdom, near to the covenant. You have now been brought in. And that is straight up gospel. That is straight up good news gospel right there. You who were once far away from salvation, you who were once pushed out and denied and barred entry for whatever reason, you are now brought in. You are now welcomed here because you have been granted salvation by Jesus. That's gospel. That is the gospel message in a nutshell. And he keeps going, verse 14. For he himself, Jesus, for Jesus himself is our peace. Not our division, our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away, peace to those who are near. For through him, we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Pay attention to the purpose statement in those verses right there and what Paul says there. It comes out in verse 15, the second part of verse 15. Let me read it again. This purpose statement of Jesus. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. The whole purpose, the whole point, the whole reason for Jesus was to grant access to those who were excluded from the kingdom. In human terms, Jesus came to make peace between believers who divide and who separate on the basis of man-made rules. Which I don't know, for me then kind of begs the question, okay, so what exactly is a man-made rule? You know, if Jesus came to make peace for those who are separated by man-made rules, and if you want to kind of play this out and think, okay, ultimately where we're going is we want to make sure the man-made rules don't get in the way. We want to make sure that we are accepting, that we are welcoming, that we are loving the people that God brings into our life, because it's clear God's bringing them into our life. And if that's the case, then what are the man-made rules? I want to make sure that I protect myself and make sure that I don't fall victim to these man-made rules that so often cause me to do what happens to all these people in these stories that we've been looking at and reading over the course of the last month. What are the man-made rules? Man-made rules be anything that people or anything that the church might put in place or impose that might say that someone is or is not acceptable or worthy to enter God's presence. Now, before you start sitting here and thinking, okay, hold on, Jason, where are you going with this? Because this starts to feel like kind of theologically dicey grounds. Where are we going with this? Look again at Jesus' example from the last few weeks. How often did we see and have we looked at stories where Jesus has crossed lines that the world said, those lines are not to be crossed. That person's not welcome. And those are man-made rules. A man-made rule would be finding ourselves inclined or prone to elevating maybe particular sins, very particular sins, to a place that says that committing this particular sin automatically keeps you out of the kingdom. Sin by itself does not keep you from being saved. Slavery to sin is what will keep you from being saved. Slavery from sin is what will keep you from entering God's kingdom. A life devoted to sin is what keeps you apart from God, not any one individual sin in and of itself is going to keep you there or keep you away. Let's humanize in a sense the theology that Paul is getting at here and what he's talking about here. Paul is writing, again, he's writing in Ephesians to a group of believers who, and this group of believers, they contain both Jewish believers and Gentile believers, and they are at odds with one another. They're fighting, they're conflicting, they're throwing labels around, they're insulting each other, they're not welcoming, they're not embracing one another. They're sort of just living in this constant state of sort of spiritual civil war in many ways going on here. And the Jewish believers, they seem to have almost this superiority complex, as he's talking about, because they refer to themselves in these kind of superlative, prideful label, this prideful term of saying that we are the circumcision. You guys are uncircumcised. You're not fully proper. You're not fully right. You're not fully here. They're better. They see themselves as being better because they are Jewish. And then Paul comes along. And Paul is coming from a background in which he's Jewish. And he's a Jewish believer. And he's not just a Jewish believer, but prior to coming to faith, prior to his encounter with Jesus on the road, he was a Pharisee. And he wasn't just any general run-of-the-mill Pharisee. What we know about Paul is that Paul was kind of the young guy that as the Pharisees were kind of standing around looking at each other, and they were thinking, man, who's the future of the church, or who's the future of our group? Who's the future of the Pharisees and our little tribe and our little group here? Who's the future? Who's the rising star in our ranks? Everybody, without doubt, they were looking at Paul, and they were saying, that Paul guy, he's the guy. He's the one who's going to rise to the top. He's the one who's eventually going to make his way and be appointed to maybe being chief priest and handling all the stuff and doing all the work at the temple. Paul is the man. See, Paul becoming a Christian was an incredibly shocking thing, an incredibly shocking and just almost unbelievable sort of thing. It's almost like, I'll use another almost kind of political example here. It's a bit like, if Tucker Carlson suddenly started speaking in favor of Joe Biden. Or if Elizabeth Warren became the Republican presidential nominee with Donald Trump as her vice president. You can't wrap your head around it. It doesn't work. This was Paul becoming a Christian. And now here's Paul writing to a group of people who are both Gentiles and Jewish believers. And he's saying, look, in verse 18, he says, look, for through him, through Jesus, because of what Jesus did, we both of us now have access to the Father by one Spirit. Both of us have access because of what Jesus has done for us. No matter, all because Jesus came. Because he came and he lived and he died and he lived again. We both have access, no matter who you are, whether you are an outcast or a ragamuffin or a sinner or a leper or a paralytic or a demoniac. It doesn't matter who you are, no matter who you are. Jesus came. You have equal access through him to the Father, through the blood of the Lamb. That's why. That's why he was born. That's why he was here. And that's all the theology, but then what does it mean for us? What does it mean for you? Verse 19. Consequently, it's a great word. Paul's like, okay, all this stuff, we both have access. Now, because of that, consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him, you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. First thing I want you to notice about those final verses is how much of this depends on Jesus. It's not just simply a good message of we're all together and we're all one because of Jesus. Really take stock or really take note of how much of this depends on Jesus. It says Paul says, look, Jesus is the cornerstone. And actually kind of adds this extra kind of layer, this extra kind of amp up. He says, Jesus is the chief cornerstone in ancient architecture, and building. The cornerstone, that was the single most important piece of an entire building. The cornerstone, for all intents and purposes, it had to be absolutely perfect in the way it was built. Because if it was even just a tiniest little bit off, one way or the other, imperfect, some tiny little flaw, that whole building was going to lean lean or tilt. It was going to be unstable. You couldn't trust it. You never knew when it was just suddenly going to fall over for whatever reason. The cornerstone was the most important thing. It was the entire stability of the building was 100% dependent on the cornerstone. And Paul says, look, Jesus is the cornerstone. It's all built. We are all built. Everything that we are, everything that we understand of ourselves is all built around and on Jesus. Jesus is the one who is holding this building called the church, capital C, people, not building, physical building. I want to be clear about that. Jesus is the one holding the building together. Not theology, not Bible translations, not sexual orientation, not politics, not economics, not race, not anything. It's none of that. It is our shared faith and our shared dependence in the work of Jesus that holds God's people together and grants us access. Jesus is the source of God with us. And Christmas, as we are now wrapping up and starting to come out of and emerge out of, Christmas is when we tend to be hyper mindful of the truth of verse 19, where Paul says that because of what Jesus has done, because Jesus came, you are no longer a foreigner and stranger to God's kingdom. You are now a fellow citizen with God's people, but also a member of his household. Not a member of his family. We like to talk about, you're now a member of God's family. Families are spread out. We spend time as families around Christmas and Easter and other kind of holidays, and people travel and they go to a lot of different places, or people travel to come here, and family travels. We're not just members of God's family, like we're really spread out, even though we are spread out. It says you are a member of God's household. The people who live in your house with you, who you don't always get along with, but ultimately you love them. You are members of God's household. There's that intimacy and that closeness that has been brought and that has been made possible because of what Jesus has done. You were once far away. And realistically, we were all at one point far away from the kingdom. You were once far away, and we have now been brought near. It's by the grace of God, by the love of God. There is no room, no more. Room has been made. We do not work. We do not fight our way to him, because he came to us. He reached out and touched our leprosy, and he made us clean. He forgave our sins, and he gave us the ability to get up and to walk. He entered our life, and he ate with us while we were still sinners. And he called us to follow him. He has given us life, restoring our humanity and giving us a story to tell. He is Emmanuel. He is God with us. Join the triumph of the skies, with angelic hosts proclaim, Christ is born in Bethlehem.